Out in the raw, unforgiving heart of the American West, a soul could be weighed, measured, and sold just like a side of beef. For 17-year-old Celia Lennox, the price tag read 6 horses and a single sack of winter flour. That's what her own father thought she was worth. The men he sold her to saw her as even less. Her story should have ended right there, in a shallow, unmarked grave somewhere in the Nebraska territory, forgotten by everyone. But the prairie has a funny way of keeping accounts. And on this day, fate was about to intervene in the form of a Lakota warrior. He was a man who had lost everything to Celia's people: his wife, his son, his peace. Yet when he laid eyes on the girl who'd been traded for livestock, he didn't see a piece of property. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a survivor. And what happens next is a story so packed with grit, betrayal, and shocking twists that it's almost impossible to believe it's true. This is the story of how a woman discarded by her own family found her true worth in the heart of a nation that was supposed to be her enemy, and how the warrior who found her would one day stand before his people and declare, "They did not sell me a slave. They gave me a treasure." The wind across the plains had a voice, and it wasn't a friendly one. It wasn't the gentle whisper through the Ohio trees Celia remembered. This was a hungry, howling cry that scraped the land bare and stole the heat right out of your bones. It was the same sound that had echoed inside their miserable sod-roofed dugout for the entire brutal winter of 1868, a winter that had already claimed their 2 milk cows, the seeds for the spring crop, and the very last flicker of hope in her father's eyes. Elias Lennox was a man chiseled from pure hardship, his face a roadmap of bad luck and worse decisions. He dragged his family west chasing the promise of the Homestead Act, a promise that had soured into a nightmare of drought, locusts, and killing frosts. Now his gaunt frame was buzzing with a desperate, dangerous energy that made Celia's skin crawl. "He's coming, Jeremiah," Elias rasped, his eyes locked on the horizon. 3 dark specks were growing larger against the bruised purple of the dawn. "Get her ready." Celia's older brother, Jeremiah, a lanky 20-year-old with his father's defeated eyes but none of his iron, flinched. "Pa, maybe we ought to reconsider. She's our kin." Elias's hand shot out like a snake, grabbing a fistful of Jeremiah's worn shirt. "Kin don't fill your belly. Kin don't pull a plow. We're starving, boy. You want to be chewing on your own boots next month? You want your ma's grave to be the last thing you see before you join her?" The threat hung in the frigid air, uglier than the frost itself. Jeremiah wilted. He always wilted. Celia stood by the cold hearth, a thin woolen shawl, her only defense against the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She'd heard the whispers, the furious, hushed arguments that had poisoned the tiny dugout for a week. She'd seen the men her father had met at the trading post. Rough, itinerant horse traders with cruel mouths and eyes that lingered on her for far too long. She just hadn't let herself believe it. She couldn't believe it. A father wouldn't. A family couldn't. But the look in her father's eyes right now told a different story. It was the look of a man who had already dug the grave and was just waiting for the body. The leader of the traders was a man named Silas Hatcher, though most folks called him Graves, for the unsettling way he smiled whenever he talked about death. He and his 2 men reined in their horses, the animals snorting clouds of steam. They were tough, wiry Mustangs, their coats shaggy for the winter. To Elias Lennox, they were beautiful. They were salvation. "Lennox," Hatcher grunted, not bothering to dismount. His gaze swept over the miserable homestead with open contempt before it landed hard on Celia. "Got the goods?" Elias didn't answer. He just shoved Jeremiah toward the dugout. "Get her out here." Jeremiah stumbled, his face a pale mask of fear and shame. He couldn't meet Celia's eyes as he grabbed her arm. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "No," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "Jeremiah, please." But her plea was swallowed by her father's roar. "No? There is no no! You'll do as you're told, girl. You'll save this family. It's the only good you've ever been." The words were colder than the wind. They cut deeper than any knife. She wasn't a daughter. She was a resource, a final crop to be traded when all the others had failed. They dragged her out into the merciless morning light, and Silas Hatcher leaned forward on his saddle horn, a grin spreading across his face, showing a picket fence of yellowed teeth. He looked her up and down like she was a horse at auction, judging her limbs, her strength, her teeth. "She's a bit on the skinny side, Lennox," Hatcher drawled, "but she's got pretty hair." "She's young," Elias said quickly, his voice high and thin. 17, strong, a good worker. Can cook, can sew. She's worth the 6 horses. 6? Hatcher let out a dry, rattling laugh. "I was thinking 4. And the flour." He gestured to a heavy sack tied to one of his pack mules. 6, Elias insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. 6 horses and the flour. "We agreed, Hatcher. A breeding pair and 4 geldings." Hatcher stared at Elias for a long, agonizing moment, letting him stew in his own misery. Then his eyes slid back to Celia. She stood frozen, silent tears streaming down her face, freezing on her cheeks. She looked at her brother, one last desperate plea in her eyes. But Jeremiah just stared at the frozen dirt, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. He had made his choice, or rather, he had chosen not to make one. And sometimes that's even worse. "All right, Lennox," Hatcher finally sighed, as if doing the man a massive favor. 6 it is, but you owe me. Next time I pass through this godforsaken territory, I'll expect a hot meal and a warm bed. No questions asked." He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice near Elias's feet. "Untie the horses." His men dismounted and began untying the lead ropes of 6 magnificent animals. To Celia, they looked like beasts of the apocalypse, each one a nail in her coffin. Jeremiah moved like a man in a dream, his hands shaking as he accepted the ropes. "Her things?" one of Hatcher's men asked, a greasy-looking man named Cole. "She don't need nothing," Elias grunted, his eyes already fixated on the horses. He was leading one, a powerful-looking roan, toward the dilapidated lean-to that served as their barn. He didn't look back. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't even acknowledge her existence. The transaction was complete. Hatcher nudged his horse closer to Celia. "Time to go, little bird." He reached down with a calloused, filthy hand. She recoiled, a spark of defiance flashing in her eyes. "I won't." His smile vanished. In a single fluid motion, he swung down from his saddle. He was shorter on the ground but thick and powerful as a bull. He grabbed her arm in a grip of iron. "You don't have a choice in the matter. You belong to me now." He didn't lift her. He threw her, sideways, onto his horse. She landed hard in front of the saddle. The breath knocked from her lungs. Before she could scream, he was back in the saddle behind her, his arm clamping around her waist like a steel band. "Pleasure doing business with you, Lennox," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Celia twisted her head, desperate for one last look, one sign that this was all a terrible mistake. She saw Jeremiah holding the ropes of her price, his face a portrait of utter misery. And she saw her father. His back was to her. He was already currying the flank of a bay mare, as if his daughter had never existed. He had his horses. As Hatcher's horse spurred into a trot, pulling away from the only home she'd ever known, a single devastating sob broke from Celia's lips. The wind snatched it away, and her family did not hear. Or perhaps they simply did not care. The world dissolved into a blur of gray prairie, endless sky, and the foul stench of unwashed men. Silas Graves Hatcher and his 2 companions, the greasy one Cole, and a quiet, mean-eyed youth they called Finn, were not kind masters. They traveled hard and fast, pushing west toward the Black Hills. Pahasapa, the Lakota called it. Sacred land. Land rich with rumors of gold and ripe for poaching game. For 3 days, Celia was their property, nothing more. She was given scraps of hardtack and dried meat, just enough to keep her from collapsing. At night, they tied her hands and feet, and she slept on the cold, hard ground, listening to their crude jokes and the predatory way they talked about her. Hatcher had claimed her as his own personal property, a fact that seemed to enrage Cole, who watched her with a simmering, possessive hunger in his eyes. Finn, the youngest, just watched everyone with a chilling emptiness, as if he were simply waiting for the world to give him a reason to commit some final, terrible act. Celia's mind retreated. The vibrant, hopeful girl from Ohio vanished, replaced by a silent, observant creature who learned the rhythm of their cruelty. She learned that crying earned her a cuff to the head, speaking earned her a threat. Silence and obedience were the only currency that bought her a few moments of peace. She was a ghost drifting through a living hell, and she was beginning to think it would never end. But she was wrong. It was about to end, just not in any way she could have possibly imagined. On the fourth day, they rode into a narrow wooded canyon. The air grew still. The cheerful chirping of prairie birds was replaced by an unnerving, heavy silence. The towering pines seemed to watch them, their ancient branches like judgmental fingers pointing down. "Don't like this," Cole muttered, shifting his rifle in his saddle. "This is Sioux land. Proper Sioux land." "Relax your spine, Cole," Hatcher sneered, though his own eyes kept darting toward the trees. "The armies put the fear of God into most of them. They're all tucked away on their reservations, counting government blankets. We'll be through this pass by sundown." But the silence was a lie. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was the held breath before a lightning strike. It happened without a sound of warning. There was no shout, no thunder of hooves, just a whisper of air. An arrow, fletched with hawk feathers, materialized from the trees and buried itself deep in Cole's throat. He made a wet, gurgling sound, his eyes wide with shock, and toppled sideways from his horse. Before his body even hit the ground, the world erupted. War cries, high, terrifying, and utterly inhuman, split the air. Lakota warriors seemed to rise from the very earth, their faces painted in stark, fierce patterns of black and red. Their horses, nimble and swift, darted between the trees like spirits. These were not the ghosts of a defeated people. They were living, breathing vengeance. Finn fumbled for his pistol, but a second arrow took him square in the chest, knocking him backward off his mount with a grunt. Hatcher roared in a mixture of fury and surprise, drawing his own Colt Peacemaker. He managed to fire one wild shot, the sound deafening in the narrow canyon, before a warrior on a magnificent black and white paint horse closed the distance with terrifying speed. The warrior was a vision of controlled fury. His face, streaked with war paint, was lean and hawkish. His long black hair was adorned with a single, proud eagle feather. He carried a short, powerful bow in one hand and a stone-headed war club in the other. He moved with a grace that was both beautiful and absolutely deadly. Hatcher aimed his pistol, but the warrior's horse slammed into his own. The war club swung in a blur. The sound of it connecting with Hatcher's skull was a sickening crack, a sound Celia would hear in her nightmares for years. The man who had bought her, who had owned her, fell from his saddle like a sack of grain. His reign of terror had ended in a single, brutal moment. In the collision, Celia was thrown from the horse, landing hard on a bed of soft pine needles. She scrambled backward, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest as the chaos subsided as quickly as it had begun. The Lakota warriors were dismounting, silently and efficiently collecting the traitors' rifles, ammunition, and horses. Then the hawk-faced warrior who had struck down Hatcher turned his attention to her. His eyes, dark and piercing, found her huddled against the base of a pine tree. He dismounted from his paint, his movements fluid and deliberate. He was tall, his buckskin leggings and shirt accentuating a physique of lean, hard muscle. He was, to Celia's terrified mind, death itself walking toward her. This was it. She had been sold by her own kind, brutalized by them, and now she would be killed by the savages she'd been taught to fear her whole life. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the final blow. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt a presence looming over her. She dared to open her eyes just a crack. The warrior was standing there, his expression unreadable behind the paint. He wasn't looking at her with malice or lust, but with a kind of intense, searching curiosity. His gaze flickered from her face to her torn dress, to the raw rope burns on her wrists. He said something in a language that sounded like water running over stones, all soft consonants and flowing vowels. It was a question, but she couldn't understand it. She could only shake her head, pressing herself harder against the tree, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. Another warrior, older, with a kindlier face, walked over and spoke to the leader in their tongue. He gestured to the dead men, then to Celia, and then pointed back the way they had come, in the direction of her former home. The leader listened, his eyes never leaving Celia. He seemed to be piecing together a story. He saw the trader's pack mule, the one that had carried the flour. He saw the extra horses, her horses, the price of her life. He saw her, a white woman, clearly not a willing companion to these men. He knelt, moving slowly so as not to startle her further. He pointed to himself. Tashunka Sapa, he said. The name was powerful, resonant. He then pointed at her, his head tilted in a silent question. Celia, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. He repeated the name softly, tasting the foreign sounds. Celia. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw something else beneath it. A flicker of defiance. The dying embers of a spirit that had not been entirely extinguished. He looked at the bodies of the traitors, men who dealt in flesh and steel, vultures of the plains. Then he looked at her again. These men had come into his people's sacred Pahasapa, armed and arrogant, and they had brought this thing with them, this pale, terrified girl. He spoke to his men, his voice calm but authoritative. They began gathering their new prizes. Tashunka Sapa, the man who would one day be known to the whites as Black Hawk, stood up. He held out a hand to her. It was not a command. It was an offer. Trembling, lost, and with absolutely no other choice in the world, Celia Lennox looked at the hand of the man who had just killed her captor. It was a strong hand, calloused from the bow and the lance, but it was steady. After a long moment, she placed her own trembling, rope-burned hand into his. He helped her to her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle. He had not bought her. He had not captured her in a raid. He had simply found her, a piece of human wreckage left in the wake of a battle. And now, under the silent gaze of the ancient pines, he had to decide what to do with her. The journey to the Lakota camp was a waking dream, surreal and terrifying. Celia rode one of the trader's horses, a gentle mare, while Black Hawk rode his paint nearby, his presence a constant, silent weight. The warriors communicated with hand signals and low murmurs, moving through the forested hills with a silent proficiency that was both unnerving and deeply impressive. They were a part of the landscape, not intruders upon it. They traveled for the rest of that day and deep into the next, stopping only for brief rests. Celia was given water from a skin and a piece of cooked rabbit that one of the warriors offered her on the tip of his knife. She ate, her desperate hunger overriding her fear. She had not been bound or threatened. In fact, they mostly ignored her, treating her less as a prisoner and more as a strange piece of baggage they were obligated to transport. Late on the second day, they emerged from the trees onto a high plateau overlooking a wide, winding river. And in the valley below, nestled in a bend of the river, was the camp. Dozens of teepees, their tanned hides glowing golden in the late afternoon sun, stood in a great circle. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the living murmur of a community. Children laughed and shouted. Dogs barked, and the low rhythmic thrum of a drum echoed from the center of the camp. It was a world away from the silent, desperate misery of her father's dugout. As they rode down into the valley, a ripple of excitement and curiosity spread through the village. People emerged from their teepees to stare. Their faces were a mixture of expressions, suspicion, wonder, and for some of the older women who had lost family to the Wasatchu, the white man, undisguised hostility. Celia felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, stripping her bare. She was the enemy, a symbol of the encroaching world that sought to destroy their way of life. Her blonde hair, once a source of girlish vanity back in Ohio, now felt like a beacon, marking her as an outsider, a target. She instinctively hunched her shoulders, wishing she could simply disappear into the earth. Black Hawk led them to the center of the camp, where he dismounted and spoke to a group of elders who had gathered. His voice was respectful but firm as he recounted the events in the canyon, gesturing occasionally toward Celia. An intense debate began, the Lakota words flying too fast for her to grasp any meaning. She understood only one thing. Her fate was being decided right here, right now. Would they kill her, ransom her, or simply drive her out into the wilderness to die alone? As the men talked, a woman detached herself from the crowd and approached Celia. She was older, her face a beautiful web of wrinkles, her long gray hair in two neat braids. She wore a simple doe-skin dress decorated with intricate quill work. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, held a deep well of both wisdom and sorrow. She stopped a few feet away and simply looked at Celia, her gaze soft and appraising. The woman pointed to herself. Wanasha, she said. The name meant flower. Celia, remembering her brief exchange with Black Hawk, swallowed hard. Celia. Wanasha nodded slowly. She stepped closer and gently touched a strand of Celia's blonde hair, her touch surprisingly soft. Then her eyes fell on the raw red burns on Celia's wrists. A flicker of understanding, of womanly compassion crossed her features. She clucked her tongue softly and said something in Lakota, her tone gentle and soothing. She then turned to the debating men and spoke. Her voice carried a quiet authority that made them all fall silent, even Black Hawk. She spoke for a long time, her words flowing with a steady, peaceful cadence. She gestured to Celia, then to the sky, then to her own heart. Though Celia couldn't understand the words, she understood the sentiment. This woman, this stranger, was defending her. When Wanasha finished, a heavy silence fell over the elders. The oldest among them, a man named Chief Charging Bear, looked at Black Hawk, then at Celia, and finally gave a slow, deliberate nod. The debate was over. Black Hawk walked to Celia's side. He looked at Wanaka with gratitude and then addressed Celia. He used a combination of the few English words he knew in sign language, a common tool for intertribal communication that Celia was beginning to decipher. You stay, he said, pointing to the ground. Then he pointed to Wanasha. She teach. Finally, he made a gesture of a teepee, of a home, her lodge. Relief washed over Celia so intensely her knees went weak. She wasn't to be killed. She wasn't to be cast out. She was to be cared for. Wanasha took her arm gently and led her away from the center of the camp, toward a modest teepee set slightly apart from the others. The whispers and stares followed them, but Wanasha's presence was a shield. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Celia felt something other than terror. She felt a sliver of hope. Inside the teepee was a haven of order and warmth. A small fire burned in the center, its smoke rising cleanly through the opening at the top. Buffalo robes were laid out for beds, and backrests woven from willow branches were propped up against the sides. The air smelled of sage and smoked leather. It was more of a home than the damp, dark dugout she had left behind. Wanaka, Celia learned, was a widow. Her husband and son had been lost years ago in a skirmish with a rival tribe. She lived alone, a respected elder known for her skill with herbs and her quiet wisdom. Over the next few weeks, Wanaka became Celia's entire world. Communication was a slow, painstaking process. Wanasha would point to an object, a water skin, a fire pit, a needle, and say the Lakota word, Imini, Pita, Tahinspa. Celia would repeat it, her tongue clumsy with the unfamiliar sounds. Wanasha would nod patiently, correcting her pronunciation with a gentle smile. She taught Celia how to scrape a hide until it was buttery soft, how to sew with an awl and sinew, how to grind corn into meal, and how to find the bitter roots that could soothe a fever. Celia learned that life was not easy here, but it was filled with purpose. Every task had a meaning. Every action contributed to the survival and well-being of the entire community. It was a stark contrast to the desperate, solitary struggle of her family's homestead. Here there was a rhythm, a sense of belonging to something larger than oneself. It was a feeling she had never known before. The children, initially wary, grew bold. They would creep up to Wanasha's teepee and peek inside, their dark eyes wide with curiosity at the white-haired woman. One brave little girl named Zinkala, or Bird, offered Celia a wildflower one day. Celia accepted it with a smile. It was the first genuine smile she'd had in months. Soon the children became another set of teachers, giggling at her mistakes and shouting Lakota words at her until she learned them out of sheer repetition. Black Hawk kept his distance, but he was always watching. Celia would feel his gaze on her as she fetched water from the river or sat with Wanasha learning beadwork. He never approached her directly, respecting the space Wanasha had created around her. But sometimes in the evening, a fresh piece of deer meat or a fat prairie hen would be left silently outside the teepee flap. Wanasha would just nod knowingly and say his name, Tashunka Sapa. Celia began to see him not as the terrifying warrior from the canyon, but as a man. She saw him playing with the children, showing them how to fletch toy arrows. She saw him listening respectfully to the elders in council, and she saw the deep, profound sadness that sometimes shadowed his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Wanaka told her, through a mix of words and gestures, that Black Hawk's wife and infant son had been taken by the shaking sickness, smallpox, that had swept through the camp 2 winters before, a disease brought by the whites. He was a man marked by the same kind of loss that she was. Her family hadn't died, but they had cut her out of their lives as surely as if they had. In a strange way, they were both orphans. In this smoky world of hidden spirit, Celia Lennox began a slow, painful transformation. The terror was receding, replaced by a cautious curiosity, and the first fragile roots of a new life were taking hold in the blood-soaked soil of the West. The seasons turned. The harsh winds of winter gave way to the gentle breezes of spring, and the prairie exploded into a riot of green grass and colorful wildflowers. And with the changing of the seasons came a profound change in Celia. Her skin, once pale and fragile, was now tanned by the sun. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and capable. She could ride a horse bareback, her blonde hair flying behind her like a banner, her laughter echoing in the river valley as she raced the Lakota children. The language, once a confusing jumble of sounds, now flowed more easily from her tongue. She could hold conversations, understand jokes, and even sing along with the women's songs as they worked. They had given her a name, Wiyaka Najin. It meant standing feather, for her resilience and the way she held her head high, even in the face of her past. She was no longer just the white-haired woman. She was one of them. The hostility she had first encountered had melted away, for most replaced by a grudging respect, and from many a genuine affection. Her bond with Black Hawk had also deepened, evolving from a distance into a quiet, profound connection. It wasn't a romance of stolen glances and flowery words, but one built on shared actions and mutual understanding. He taught her how to track a deer, showing her how to read the story left in broken twigs and disturbed earth. She, in turn, showed him how to mend a tear in his buckskin shirt with the fine, neat stitches her mother had taught her back in Ohio, a skill the Lakota, who used cruder awl and sinew methods, found fascinating. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of orange and violet, they sat by the river watching the water flow. It was one of the first times they had been truly alone together, without the comforting presence of Wanasha or the curious eyes of the village. "You are not afraid of the river anymore, Wiyaka Najin," Black Hawk said, his voice a low rumble. He remembered how she had flinched from the water when she first arrived, how she had washed herself with trembling hands. "It is hard to be afraid of something that gives life," Celia replied in Lakota, her accent still present, but her meaning perfectly clear. "Here, everything has a purpose. The river, the sun, the buffalo, even the smallest flower." She looked at him, her blue eyes clear and direct. "Even me, perhaps." Black Hawk picked up a smooth, flat stone and skipped it across the water's surface. It danced 4 times before sinking into the current. "The white men who brought you here," he said, his jaw tightening slightly at the memory, "they saw you as a thing, something to be traded for a horse." Celia flinched. The memory was still a raw wound. "My father," she said softly. "He saw the same. A man who cannot see the value of his own blood is a blind man," Black Hawk stated, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. He turned to look at her, his dark eyes intense. "My friend Grey Wolf, he asked me why I brought you here. Why I brought a Washoe woman into our camp. He said you would bring trouble. The soldiers." Celia's heart sank. This was the fear that always lingered in the back of her mind, the one thing that could shatter this fragile peace she had found. "Am I trouble, Tashunka Sapa?" He reached out and, for the first time, tucked a stray strand of blonde hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, sending a shiver through her entire body. I told him this, Black Hawk said, his voice soft but resonant with a powerful conviction. Her family sold her for horses, thinking they were gaining wealth. But they were fools. His eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw a reflection of herself she had never seen before. Someone strong, someone worthy. They did not sell me a slave or a captive, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. They gave me a treasure. The word he used in Lakota, Woonspii, was more than just treasure. It meant a sacred possession, a source of strength, something of great spiritual value. Tears welled in Celia's eyes, but for the first time in a very long time, they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. To be seen, truly seen for who she was, not as a burden, not as property, but as a person of worth, it was a gift more precious than all the horses in the territory. No one has ever seen me that way, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Then they were all blind, he said simply. From that day on, the invisible wall between them crumbled. Their companionship became the talk of the village, but it was met mostly with nods of approval. The warrior who had lost his family and the woman who had been abandoned by hers had found solace in each other. It was a good match, a healing match. Wanaka watched them with a proud, knowing smile, but as their bond deepened, a shadow was creeping back into Celia's life. A ghost from the world she had left behind. A ghost with a familiar face and a soul full of guilt. A ghost named Jeremiah. Hundreds of miles to the east, Jeremiah Lennox was living in his own private, self-made hell. The 6 horses had not brought salvation. They had brought only shame. His father Elias remained a bitter, cruel man, working the horses to exhaustion and still failing to tame the stubborn land. The spring planting had been a disaster, a late frost killing most of the fragile seedlings. The homestead was still a place of grim, silent desperation, but now it was layered with Jeremiah's suffocating guilt. Every time he looked at the horses, he saw Celia's face, her eyes pleading with him as she was dragged away. He heard her single sob carried away on the wind. His father's words, "It's the only good you've ever been," haunted his sleep. He had been a coward. He had stood by and let his own sister be sold like an animal. The knowledge ate at him, gnawed at his soul until he could no longer bear it. He couldn't fix what was broken in his father, and he couldn't fix the failed farm. But maybe, just maybe, he could fix his one great sin. He had to get Celia back. He had to save her. In his mind, she was a captive of the vile Silas Hatcher, or, if Hatcher was dead, of the bloodthirsty Sioux who had surely killed him and taken her for their own. He pictured her suffering, enslaved, praying for the rescue he had been too weak to offer before. One morning, fueled by a toxic mixture of guilt and a desperate need for redemption, Jeremiah took the strongest of the horses, a portion of their dwindling supplies, and rode away from the homestead without looking back. He didn't ride west into the unknown wilderness. He rode north, toward the Platte River and the lifeline of the West, the Oregon Trail. He rode for the nearest bastion of American power, a place where he could tell his story and find help. He rode for Fort Laramie. He arrived days later, a dusty, wild-eyed figure on a fine-looking horse. He sought out the fort's commander, a career soldier named Captain Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a pragmatic by-the-book officer, a veteran of the Civil War who understood the complex and bloody politics of the plains better than most. "Captain," Jeremiah said, his voice cracking with emotion as he stood in the commander's sparse office, "my name is Jeremiah Lennox. My sister Celia, she's been taken by the Sioux." Thorne leaned back in his chair, his expression weary. He'd heard 100 stories like this. "Taken from where, son?" "From our homestead, down in Nebraska territory," Jeremiah lied. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but to admit she was sold would be to admit his own complicity, and no one would help a coward. So he had to create a simpler, more heroic narrative. "A Lakota war party, they attacked us. They killed my pa, and they took her. They took my sister." The lie grew, taking on a life of its own. It was easier than the truth. It made him a victim, a grieving brother, not a collaborator in his sister's destruction. Captain Thorne steepled his fingers, his sharp blue eyes studying the young man. Jeremiah's distress seemed genuine enough, and the law was clear. The army was obligated to retrieve white captives from Indian territory. It was a matter of federal policy and national pride. Can you describe her, son? Blonde hair, sir, bright as corn silk, blue eyes, 17 years old. Thorne sighed internally. A young blonde woman was a potent symbol. Her capture was the kind of story that inflamed tensions and sold newspapers back east. He had his orders. Do you know which band took her? Where they might be? They rode west, Jeremiah said, pointing vaguely, toward the Paha Sapa, the Black Hills. Thorne stood up and walked to a large map pinned to the wall. He tapped a region marked with the names of several Lakota bands. Black Hawk's band of Oglala are known to winter near there. They've been troublesome lately, raiding traders who stray off the main trails. The name meant nothing to Jeremiah, but it solidified his story. It gave the faceless savages a name. It must be them, sir. You have to get her back. Captain Marcus Thorne looked from the desperate young man to the vast, dangerous territory on the map. He didn't want another Indian war, but he couldn't ignore a direct report of a captured American citizen. His duty was clear. Sergeant, he called out, his voice sharp. Assemble a company. We ride at dawn. As Jeremiah was led away to be given food and quarters, a wave of triumphant relief washed over him. He was finally doing the right thing. He was going to rescue Celia. He was going to be a hero. He never once considered the possibility that the woman he was riding to save was not a captive. He never considered that she was, for the first time in her life, finally home. And he had just declared war on her new family. The news of the soldiers' approach struck the Lakota camp like a bolt of lightning from a clear blue sky. Two young hunters, their faces grim and their horses lathered in sweat, galloped into the village center, shouting the alarm. Soldiers are coming, a long blue snake of them, riding from the east. Panic rippled through the camp. Women gathered their frightened children, their faces pale with fear. Men grabbed their rifles and bows. The peaceful daily rhythm of their lives was shattered in an instant. Black Hawk met with Chief Charging Bear and the other elders, his mind racing. It was no coincidence. A full company of cavalry didn't just wander this deep into their territory by accident. And when the hunters described the guide, a young white man on a strong roan horse, a sickening certainty fell upon him. He found Celia by the river, where she was helping Wanacha gather reeds for basket weaving. He approached her gently, not wanting to frighten her. Wiyaka Najin, he said, using her Lakota name. The soldiers, they have a guide, a young man from the east. Celia's hands went still. She looked up, her blue eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror. She didn't need him to say the name. Jeremiah, she whispered, the sound a ghost on her lips. The lie he must have told was instantly, painfully clear to her. This wasn't a rescue. It was an act of selfish, destructive penance. The warriors gathered in the center of the camp, their voices a low, angry rumble. The white-haired woman has brought them to us. A fierce warrior named Gray Wolf spat, his hand gripping his rifle. She is a magnet for trouble. We should fight. Drive them from our land before they burn our homes. A chorus of agreement rose from the younger men, all of them hot-blooded and ready to defend their honor and their families. No! Celia's voice cut through the rising tension, clear and sharp as shattered glass. She stepped into the center of the circle, her fear eclipsed by a fierce, protective resolve. If you fight them, you give them the excuse they are looking for. They will call it a battle, but it will be a massacre, and you will prove my brother's lie for him. She faced them all, the warriors, the elders, the man she loved. This is my fault. The ghost of my life before has followed me here. He is my brother, and I am the reason he has come. Let me face him. Let me speak to them in their own tongue. They will not listen to a woman, Grey Wolf scoffed. They will listen to this woman, Black Hawk countered, his voice a low thunderclap of authority as he moved to stand beside her. Her spirit is strong. Her path is wiser than sending our men to die against the soldiers' cannons. The debate was tense, But Black Hawk's unwavering support, coupled with the wisdom of Chief Charging Bear and Wanacha, won out. They would not seek a battle. They would make a stand, but they would let Standing Feather speak first. As the warriors rode out to position themselves silently in the hills near Painted Creek, Wanaka led a trembling Celia back to their teepee. The old woman didn't dress her in simple work clothes. Instead, she brought out a sacred ceremonial gown of the softest doe skin, adorned with brilliant blue beadwork that shimmered like water. She carefully braided Celia's blonde hair in the Lakota way, weaving in strands of colored porcupine quills. "You are not the girl who was sold, Celia Lennox," Wanacha said softly, her touch a blessing. "You are Wiyaka Najin, Standing Feather of the Oglala. Show them who you are now." When Celia emerged from the teepee, a hush fell over the remaining villagers. She was a figure of two worlds, her pale hair and blue eyes a stark contrast to the buckskin and beads. But her bearing, her posture, her spirit, it was all Lakota. Black Hawk brought her mare, his heart tight with a terrible mixture of pride and fear. This was her battle, and he could only watch from the sidelines. "My heart is with you, Standing Feather," he murmured, his voice low and for her ears only. "And mine with you, Tashunkasapa," she replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Together they rode out to the creek to face the army her brother had summoned, to confront the past that refused to stay buried. Captain Marcus Thorne raised a leather-gloved hand, his voice cutting cleanly through the nervous morning air. "Company, halt!" The column of 70 U.S. cavalrymen clattered to a stop, the sound of jingling harnesses and strained leather echoing in the sudden quiet. Before them lay Painted Creek, its water running clear and shallow over a bed of smooth stones. On the opposite bank, a line of Lakota warriors sat astride their horses, as still and silent as the rocky hills that rose behind them. They were not painted for war, Thorne noted with a professional eye, but they were armed, their faces impassive masks of stone. His gaze swept the low hills flanking the creek, his experienced eye catching the subtle signs of movement, the glint of sun on a rifle barrel. He was being watched by at least 100 more. It was a masterful display, a clear invitation to parley, underlined by the unmistakable threat of annihilation. Beside him, Jeremiah Lennox trembled, his knuckles ghost-white on his reins. The guilt that had propelled him for weeks had curdled into a volatile mix of fear and righteous fury. He saw only the enemy, the savages his father had cursed for years. "That's them, Captain," he hissed, his voice thin and reedy. "I see him, the leader on the paint horse. That's Black Hawk." "I see him, Mr. Lennox," Thorne replied, his tone clipped. He found the young man's agitation distasteful. A soldier's work required a cool head. "Hold your position. No man fires unless I give the direct command." Thorne nudged his horse forward, breaking from the line and stopping at the water's edge. He raised an open palm, a universal sign of peace. "I am Captain Marcus Thorne of the United States Army," he called out, his voice projecting across the creek. "I come in peace to speak with Chief Black Hawk." The Lakota leader, a figure of imposing dignity on his black and white paint, did not move. His eyes, dark and piercing, met Thorne's across the distance. A long, tense moment passed. Thorne could feel the collective breath of his men held behind him. This was the razor's edge, where talk could turn to bloodshed in a single heartbeat. Then a figure detached from the Lakota delegation. It was not Black Hawk. This rider moved with a fluid grace, urging their horse forward into the shallow creek. Thorne's brow furrowed in confusion. It was a woman dressed in a breathtakingly intricate doeskin gown, the beadwork shimmering like captured light. Her hair was bound in two long braids in the Lakota style, but the hair itself, it was the color of sun-bleached corn silk. Jeremiah let out a choked cry, a sound of agony and elation. "Celia, by God, it's her! That's my sister!" He kicked his heels, surging forward, but Thorne's arm shot out like a steel bar, blocking his path. "I said, hold, boy!" Thorne commanded, his eyes narrowed. Something was not right here. This was not the picture of a terrified captive. This was something else entirely. Celia stopped her mare in the middle of the creek, positioning herself as a bridge between the two armed forces. She held her chin high, her posture exuding a calm authority that was utterly alien to the girl Jeremiah remembered. She fixed her gaze on her brother, and in her eyes he saw not a plea for rescue, but a profound and shattering disappointment. "Jeremiah," she called out. Her voice was not the whisper he remembered, but a clear, steady bell tone that carried an unfamiliar weight. "Celia, thank God," he sobbed, the tears he'd held back for weeks finally breaking free. "We've come for you. Don't be afraid. We'll get you away from these heathens." A sad, weary smile touched her lips. It was a smile of pity, and it stung Jeremiah more than any physical blow could have. "Save me, brother," she asked, her voice laced with a sorrowful irony. "Are you here to save me from my home? Are you here to save me from my family?" Jeremiah's mind reeled in confusion. The scene wasn't playing out as it had in his frantic daydreams. "What? What are you saying? They've done something to you, Celia. They've twisted your mind. They're savages." "No," she said, her voice hardening now, the sorrow being burned away by a rising flame of indignation. "The only ones who ever twisted my mind were the ones who taught me my life had no value. These people," she gestured behind her to Black Hawk and his warriors, "have shown me nothing but honor. They gave me a name and a place in their hearts when my own father decided I was worth less than livestock." The accusation hung in the air, stunning the soldiers into a shocked silence. Jeremiah flinched as if she had physically struck him. "They saved me, Jeremiah," Celia continued, her voice rising, each word a hammer blow against his fantasy of heroic rescue. "They saved me from the monster our father sold me to. Did you forget that part of the story when you spoke to the captain? Did you forget watching Pa trade me for 6 horses and a sack of flour? You stood there. You watched him do it. You held the lead ropes in your own 2 hands, Jeremiah. Tell me, did you enjoy the ride home on my price?" A wave of murmurs and shocked whispers swept through the cavalry line. Men turned to stare at Jeremiah, their expressions shifting from sympathy to open contempt. Captain Thorne turned a glacial glare on the young man, his face a thundercloud of fury. This entire dangerous expedition, the risk to his men, the near start of a new Indian war, was all predicated on a lie. "Sold?" Thorne bit out the word, his voice low and lethal. Jeremiah could only stammer, his face ashen. She doesn't know what she's saying." Celia ignored him now, her full attention on the captain. She saw in his eyes not a bloodthirsty Indian hater, but a professional soldier, a man of order, and she hoped of honor. "I was not captured, Captain Thorne," she declared, her voice ringing with the undeniable clarity of truth. "My name was Celia Lennox. I was sold by my father and abandoned by my brother. I was left for dead, and these people found me. They took me in. They healed my wounds, and they mended a spirit that my own kin had shattered. They have treated me with a dignity I never knew." She straightened her back, a queen surveying her domain. The water swirled around her horse's legs, the sun catching in her blonde braids. "My name is no longer Celia Lennox. That girl is dead. I am Wiyaka Najin, standing feather of the Oglala Lakota. This," she swept her arm to encompass the hills and the people behind her, "is my home. These are my people. And you, Captain, have brought an army to their doorstep based on the cowardly lie of a boy who couldn't face his own shame." The truth, stark and undeniable, had been laid bare for all to see. Jeremiah finally broke. A pathetic animal wail of despair tore from his throat. "He made me do it, Celia. Pa did. We were starving. And now you have led soldiers to the homes of the only people who ever fed me when I was starving," she answered, her voice turned to ice. "Go home, Jeremiah. Go back to your stolen horses. I have no brother by that name." She had disowned him, utterly and irrevocably, in front of 70 armed men. He slumped in his saddle, the last of his self-deception stripped away, leaving only the raw, weeping wound of his cowardice. Captain Thorne was a man trapped. His casus belli was a fraud. The white captive was a proud Lakota woman, demanding he leave her home. To attack now would be an act of outright murder, a stain on the honor of his uniform and his country. To retreat might be seen as weakness, but to fight would be a crime. He looked at the defiant woman in the creek. He looked at the silent, waiting warriors on the hills. He looked at the broken, lying boy beside him. There was only one honorable choice. With a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to cost him a great deal, Captain Thorne lowered his hand. He turned in his saddle to face his sergeant major. "Turn the company around." "Sir?" the sergeant asked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You have your orders, Sergeant," Thorne snapped. "We are leaving." He steered his horse to where Jeremiah sat, sobbing uncontrollably. "You will ride at the rear of this column, Mr. Lennox, under guard. We will have a very long discussion about filing false reports with the United States Army when we return to the fort." As the soldiers began the clumsy, noisy process of turning back, Celia's body began to shake, the rigid control she'd maintained finally dissolving. Black Hawk urged his paint horse forward, entering the creek and stopping beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply reached out and took her hand, his strong fingers wrapped around hers, a silent affirmation of everything she had done. From the hills, a single piercing cry of victory shot into the air, quickly answered by 100 more voices. It was a sound of pure triumph. Their standing feather had won the battle without a single arrow being fired. As Celia and Blackhawk turned their horses and rode back toward their people, hand in hand, she knew the ghost of Celia Lennox was finally laid to rest. She was Wiakanajin, and she was home. The story of Standing Feather and Blackhawk is not just a relic of the Old West. It's a powerful testament to the human spirit. It shows us that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one that chooses us, the one that sees our worth when no one else will. Celia's journey from being a piece of property to a treasured leader reminds us that our true value lies not in what can be bought or sold, but in our courage, our honor, and our capacity to love. Theirs was a love story written against a backdrop of immense cruelty and change, a small flame of hope in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. If this story of resilience, identity, and finding a home in the most unexpected of places moved you, please help us share more tales from the forgotten corners of history. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true sagas from the Wild West. Let us know in the comments, what part of their story resonated with you the most? Thank you for listening.